Are you ready for the economic smackdown over the debt ceiling? We are hearing about how far apart the right and left are. With all the trash talk happening, you may wonder, what is the debt ceiling? As of the date of this video, our national debt is now more than $30 trillion and poised to rise even higher. If you're watching this in 10 years, it's projected to be at $50 trillion. With all the spending that we do with no apparent concern, it might surprise you to learn there's supposed to be a legal limit on the debt load our nation can accumulate, which is called the debt ceiling. Today, we'll explain what the debt ceiling is and why it's not actually a ceiling on this edition of Economics Made Simple. The debt ceiling represents the limit on the amount of debt the federal government is allowed to take on. Here to explain the debt ceiling, including why it's not actually a ceiling, is our special guest, Jane.
Thank you for having me on again. Let's get ready to rumble. The debt ceiling, or debt limit, is the total amount of money the federal government can borrow to meet its legal obligations. The limit applies to the total amount of federal debt. That means it represents both the part of the debt held by the public and the part the government owes itself as a result of borrowing from government accounts, including the trust funds from which Social Security and Medicare benefits are paid.
So the debt ceiling is basically the amount the federal government can borrow. That makes sense. But when was the debt ceiling first established?
The roots of the debt ceiling can be traced back to 1917. Prior to that year, when the federal government wanted to borrow, Congress had to separately authorize the Treasury to issue debt instruments for specific purposes. With America's entry into World War I, the government passed legislation giving the Treasury more authority to issue bonds on its own. The legislation also created a limit on the total dollar amount of bonds that could be issued. The debt ceiling we know today, an aggregate limit that covers all types of federal debt, was established by Congress in 1939. The debt ceiling has been modified more than 100 times since the end of World War II. The overriding reason is the frequency with which the federal government reaches the limit before the nation's legal pre-authorized obligations have been financed.
Okay, so now that we know the history, can you tell us what happens when we hit the debt ceiling?
Of course, I'd be happy to explain. This actually brings up an important point. An increase in the debt ceiling does not enable new spending. New spending is authorized by Congress only through the annual budget, which raises the question, if raising the debt ceiling is only about ensuring that current obligations are met, why doesn't Congress simply raise it whenever it's reached? The reason is that fiscal hawks can use the debt ceiling as leverage to try to force cuts in government spending. In such cases, some members of Congress may decide against voting to raise the ceiling unless there's an agreement to limit future spending. Whenever the debt ceiling is reached, the Treasury Department will resort to what are called extraordinary measures to keep the government from formally defaulting on its obligations. Extraordinary measures involve using available cash and various accounting maneuvers to ensure principal obligations are met.
Wait, extraordinary measures? What does that even mean?
Well, the use of extraordinary measures typically buys the government up to several months of additional time before it's faced with the prospect of default. However, if the debt ceiling still has not been raised by the time those extraordinary measures are exhausted, the government could default on its debt, something it has never done up to this point.
Okay, what would happen if we default?
By virtually all accounts, the consequences of a default by the U.S. government would be catastrophic and likely trigger a global financial crisis. As I said, the U.S. government has never before defaulted on its obligations. But as the national debt continues growing to seemingly astronomical levels, experts say the unsustainability of America's fiscal outlook grows right along with it.
Thanks so much, Jane, for that clear and informative explanation of yet another of our nation's fiscal curiosities.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Well, that's it for today. As always, if you've enjoyed this video, please don't hesitate to hit the subscribe button and keep on the lookout for more Economics Made Simple.